But one thing I might want to be really clear about is we don't need any additional studies to know the harms of wireless radiation. It's there, it's significant, it's been proved decisively many, many times. And so that's kind of what the industry says. Well, more research is needed. And of course, we're keeping that research from happening.
Yeah.
The only reason we need more research is to answer some of the detailed questions.
Right.
We know it's harmful, but now what can we do to make it less harmful?
Welcome to The Wave Forward, the podcast that dives deep into how technology shapes our health and well-being. From digital wellness to tech innovation to the effects of electromagnetic fields, we cover the environmental, social, and physical implications of technology. Ready to navigate the digital landscape with confidence? Set your dial to Discovery and tune in. You're listening to The Wave Forward. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining the podcast. I am here with Dr. Kent Chamberlin. Thank you so much for joining, Dr. Kent.
My pleasure.
I know that you weren't actively pursuing the life of educating people about EMF. So give me a little bit of insight on what were you doing before and how this happened.
Well, I was chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. And at the time, I thought wireless radiation was completely, well, not completely harmless, but mostly harmless. I would get asked about it a fair amount at presentations for parents and things like that. And what I would tell people is, yeah, you don't want to hold your phone right next to your head, hold it away a little bit.
Yeah.
And, maybe not 24/7, but it's basically innocuous. I said nothing about not putting it on your body. So again, my basic understanding, my basic belief was that wireless radiation was harmless. And I felt this way because of our trade publication, the IEEE, Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. It's our trade group.
Mm-hmm.
And so they came out periodically with articles saying, oh, it's harmless, it's harmless. So I've had this embedded in me, imbued over my entire career.
Wow.
And so when I was asked to join this commission, and I'll be talking about the commission during our talk today, I thought, well, this isn't going to last very long. There's no problem with wireless radiation, so we're going to read the literature and we're going to just be done. But that's not what I found. What I found is that, and what we found, that as a commission, and I'll be saying more about the commission itself, but we found out that it was harmful. So I can talk about the commission because I think it's important that people know how we came to the conclusion and who we were that made that came to that conclusion. I should also, in the starting off here, is point out that I'm not being paid by anyone for being here today, nor have I been paid for any of the previous presentations that I've given. I've given them around, well, actually did a European tour last summer, presented at the London Royal Society of Medicine. A lot of people are interested in this topic. But the key point here is that I'm not getting paid to be here.
Yeah.
And if you hear a message from people in industry, for example, they'll tell you that wireless radiation is absolutely harmless. And the reason they'll tell you this is, well, it would cost them a lot. It would cut down on their profits. They'd still have great profits, but it would cut down on them if they had more reasonable limits. And we'll talk about that too, where the limits came from and what it is that the commission found out that led it to its conclusions.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is the commission and who is it that actually contacted you to be part of this?
Well, this was done through the chancellor of the system, but the reason the commission was formed in the first place is that legislators, and by the way, legislators are often at times asked to deal with thousands of pieces of legislation, bills, every legislative cycle. So they don't have time to dive into every issue, particularly complex ones like cell phone radiation. So these legislators were being told by their constituents, hey, we're being harmed by wireless radiation, by cell tower radiation, and here's some science to prove it. And yet these same legislators were being told by industry, no, wireless radiation is absolutely harmless, and you need to put in more infrastructure in your state to remain competitive. So what's a poor legislator to do? Well, they wrote the legislation, and that's what it takes. It's not a small thing to come up with a commission. You have to write legislation, you have to promote it within the legislature, both houses of the legislature, and then get it voted on and signed by the governor. But that's the process that went through. And so the whole point was to bring together what some people have referred to as a dream team that have the right expertise to draw the conclusions regarding the harms of wireless radiation. Now, in the beginning, they wanted to focus more on 5G, and I'll talk more about that later.
Yeah.
But we ended up saying, well, and finding out that it's not just 5G, it's not just cell towers, it's all wireless radiation devices. And I'll talk about that also, about what is a wireless radiation device.
You didn't apply for this or anything like that. Like,
Oh,
did
no,
someone
no, no.
reached out to you? Yeah.
No, a little bit of arm twisting went
Yeah.
on too, but
We
that's
need
fine.
you.
Yeah, so, but it's an impartial commission in the sense that none of us were paid, none of us were affiliated with the cell phone industry except for the company representatives. We had people representing the cell phone industry. And actually, they were not very knowledgeable. They weren't scientists, but we did have people with expertise in medicine. We had 2 medical doctors on board, toxicology, epidemiology, biostatistics, physics, you name it. We had the expertise to answer the questions being posed to us. And what were those questions? Well, what were the main ones? And I think this swayed a lot of legislators in voting for this legislation. So one of the things was, if this wireless radiation is harmless, why won't any insurance companies insure against it? And I'm talking about Lloyd's of London. So they won't insure somebody for the harms caused by wireless radiation. They know it's something that's likely to come up later on. But that's the type of question, and it was built into the legislation that we were asked to address and address specifically. So one thing that we did is we did a literature search. What's in the peer-reviewed literature, and to do that, we wanted to make sure that the literature that we looked through was valid. And I'm going to be the first person to say that not all peer-reviewed publications are truthful, contain, accurate information. I know that from being a department chair, from serving on college-wide promotion and tenure committees, and also as being, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, that I was the associate editor for a major publication. This is an IEEE transaction on antennas and propagation, and I was an associate editor for 3 years. And so I learned a lot about assessing the quality of journals. Now, the
I feel
reason
like that's a really good point that you came in with a very deep understanding of how to analyze research, because a lot of people don't know how to do that.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I agree. And that was one of the functions that I performed. So I also didn't only trust myself, but I brought in the college librarian with a PhD in library sciences, and she and I worked together to identify the quality of journals, which I think we did. I had thought going in that I would know how to do it, and I know how to do it better now. And one thing that was claimed, and it will be claimed, so if anybody out there listens to presentations given by the cell phone industry about the harms of wireless radiation, one of their claims is that the only articles showing harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. All I can say is very clearly that there are articles showing harm from top-tier journals, and the articles that show harm are in the majority. And like 91% of the articles that address the issue of oxidative stress, and I can say more about that in a moment, the 91% of the articles that looked at that did find an effect from wireless radiation exposure. In other words, if you're exposed to wireless radiation, it kind of counters the fact that you're eating blueberries and taking vitamin C, which is why we take those, is to lower our free radical load. Free radicals, oxidative stress, very similar.
So you said 91%. So like there was like over 250, right? Over 250 studies that you're looking at to get that 91%. It's not just like, oh, there were 5 studies.
I'm glad you're raising that issue. Yes, exactly. Yes. So the 91% of a large number of articles.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I wonder what the other 9%, how the data looks on those.
Well, and what we found is that when we looked at the findings from 2010, a lot of them were industry articles, industry funded research. They showed, there's not much. No, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be cynical, but like in that case, the industry funded studies, about only a fifth of them showed a problem. But the fact
Wow.
that even a fifth would show an issue isn't something that you should ignore,
No.
particularly when you're exposing people and children 24/7 to this harmful radiation.
Without consent, really. I mean,
Well, that is the issue. It's a
yeah.
consent. Matter of fact, consent came into play in the New Hampshire Commission. And that is in determining where you can and can't, or should or shouldn't locate cell towers. We felt like it would be that the risk from wireless radiation is something that citizens themselves should control. Just like if you're driving, you can control your degree of safety by how you drive, whether or not you wear your seatbelt. I mean, I know it's by law, you're
Yeah.
supposed to, but you're under control of so many things. And we wanted to keep it that way for cell phone radiation also. And that is, uh, if you put a tower next to somebody's house, a cell tower, they can't control it, they can't turn it off.
Is it that they truly don't have to have any consent, or is there something written that when you purchase a cell phone, you are consenting to, you know what I mean? Like, I wonder how that is. And when you purchase a phone, you know, you sign all those documents. I wonder if there's something in there that's like, you agreed to
Well,
partake in this giant experiment. No.
well, I'm glad you put it in terms of an experiment because that's indeed what it is.
Yeah.
But no, but that's your choice. And so I want people to know that are listening to this, that if you use a cell phone and if you live near a cell tower or you have a Wi-Fi router, you are exposing yourself and that's your choice.
Yeah.
But what if you choose not to? And there are some people who cannot choose not to. It's called electromagnetic hypersensitivity, and it's a growing number of people. Perhaps 5% of the population have I'm not even sure what to call it, a syndrome.
Mm.
Because if they're exposed to wireless radiation, they get headaches, nausea, uh, some of them, heart palpitations, I mean, the list goes on, and it's real. This isn't something that's in people's heads. There are lots of studies have been done that show this is a real effect. So I'm thinking about individuals like that.
Yeah.
The fact that we are all affected by wireless radiation, but some of us have these acute effects that causes very severe problems. And in other words, a person with that's severe, and I've experienced these people myself. I know them. If you walk into a room, they can tell you if your cell phone is turned on or not.
Actually, if you guys have listened to the last episode of the podcast that's live right now with Mike Bender, he tells his whole story. He had Lyme disease, and then he was in a home that had black mold in the plenum of the air conditioning vent, which like activated his Lyme. And then he was like, he could tell when his wife's phone was on in her pocket.
It's
And she'd
real.
be like, no, it's off, it's off. And he'd be like, no, it's on. Check your pocket.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it supports the fact, from what I've seen and what the research supports.
Right.
So what
I
if
love
you're
that you're
first,
here saying that because, you know, what we just recorded was someone's personal story, but to have someone come in and be like, no, the research actually is like indicative of this, that this is a real thing. It's not just in your mind.
that's absolutely right. So it is supported, and we have lots and lots of evidence to support that. But for people like that, I mean, they don't have a choice. They
Right.
can't be near radiation. And I know people who have been living very nice lives, enjoying, living in the home that they always wanted. And then a cell tower gets put in and they have to move. It's real. You'll hear numbers from, just a few percent, like 5% up to like 20% reduction in property values when a cell tower goes up. So if you're not concerned about the health issues, do be concerned about your property values if a cell tower goes up near you.
Good friends of mine actually were able to stop a cell tower from going up with this exact model. And the other part of that what they were disputing was that they had put all over their website, because they have a retreat center, so they had put all over their website that they were a low EMF facility. And so when they went to go, I don't know where they went. I don't know if they had to go to the courthouse or wherever, but when they went to go fight it, they were like, this is actually going to not just affect our real estate, but it's going to affect our personal business that we have here, because we are known for low EMF, and they were able to stop the cell tower from going up. So I feel like this is a really great segue into the FCC, because I remember in our last conversation, and I did not know this, that you had said somewhere, and I couldn't remember if it was in the FCC regulations or if it was something else, where they basically said you cannot fight cell towers with health.
Yeah, this is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And there was heavy lobbying from the wireless industry, because when you hear what I'm about to say, you're going to say, how could that possibly happen? Well, money buys things. And
Yeah.
so when you look at the spending by the telecommunications industry leading up to that legislation that I'm about to talk about, their donations tripled in the years leading up to it. So what they wanted and what they got was something put into the legislation that said you can't use health or in the environment to fight a cell tower. I mean, to me as a citizen, this is absolutely crazy. Well, of course you'd want to consider that. But they got it built into the legislation, Section 704 of the TCA, Telecommunications Act, and it has allowed the telecom industry to put in towers in places where people were fighting it tooth and nail, because the people understood the harms of wireless radiation and so
That's
even
so
though
wild. And
it
not to get
is,
all conspiracy, but it's like, okay, so does that mean they
well,
knew
oh, they knew, and because
technology?
the harms of wireless radiation have been known for a long time, a
Yeah.
long time. In the 40s, 50s, I mean, it's been known. And so going into, and understanding that your business model is to roll out these towers. You can't sell cell phones, and you can't, sell your people subscriptions to having a cell phone unless you have the infrastructure in place. So, and then they must have known, or they did know,
Yeah. Like, hey, this is going to be an issue. We're going to have to
it
address
will
this
be an
before
issue.
we,
So
yeah.
how do we cut this off at the pass? Well, you will
Yeah.
pay off our politicians to put legislation in the legislation that
Yeah.
they can't fight it on health.
That's your job. When you're coming in and you want to make a multi-billion-dollar company, your job is to know and address what the foreseeable problems will be before you deploy that business, before you throw loads and loads of money into that business. So it makes so much sense that back in the 1990s, right, that they would have,
1996.
yeah, like right when technology was really starting to kind of become part of the forefront of everything. They obvious, I mean, I'll
You're
stop
having
there.
the same reaction that I am. When I first heard about this, that they couldn't use health as a problem, I was just dumbfounded. It took me a while to believe it. And what's going on with the FCC that would allow them to do this? And this, I'm speaking of me personally, and also in the commission. You can imagine some of the conversations we had about that. How could they do that? And we've figured that out. And I'll mention the idea of agency capture, and that's something we found out about. I should also point out that some of the people on the commission were legislators themselves and were pretty savvy. They had been legislators for a long time. And so they brought us or introduced the idea of agency capture. And that's exactly what's going on with the FCC. And this isn't some conspiracy theory. This is the Harvard Center for Ethics and I hope we can publish the slides from this
Yes, for sure.
talk,
Yeah, I can
because
plug
I
in.
have links in my slides, and that people can go to, click on the links, and it'll bring them to the sites that I'm talking about. But the Harvard Center for Ethics came out with a report on captured agency, how the FCC is controlled by the industries it presumably regulates. So that's what's going on right there, is that people who run the FCC were formerly people who ran the telecom industries, and they kind of go in and out of this revolving door. So that's what's going on. That's why it's going on.
Yeah.
And
It's hard to wrap your head. I mean, I understand why it's difficult to wrap your head around that level of deception. Like, you want to just immediately be like, there's just no possible way it could have gotten to that point without someone stepping in and saying no. But if you like really start looking into all of the history of captured agency, and you really, I mean, it comes out eventually. It's not like, oh, this is happening and we don't know it's happening. It's like, no, there are records and records and records of lawsuits and lawsuits and lawsuits and billions of dollars that had to have been paid from all of these different things that we were told were safe and then ended up being harmful. So yes, it's hard to wrap your head around, but when you really understand that, it actually probably was pretty easy to know that EMFs were harmful and keep it pretty tight and under wraps and create the story of it's not, it's fine. And honestly, I don't even personally think that they create the story of it's perfectly safe. I just think they don't address it at all. Like when you're looking at, a Verizon ad or a telecommunication ad, they're just telling you how fast the speed is going to be. There's no addressing, okay, what does this mean? I see the commercial of it flying and through the windows and through the house and coming at, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my body? They don't address that. It's not like they're saying it's perfectly safe. They're just also not addressing, is it harmful?
But they
So I
will
think that's
say
really
it's
interesting.
perfectly safe. And I hear
Right.
them repeat it again and again. And when I go in to present to communities, they want to hear from me and they want to hear from the telecom industry. And the telecom industry will flat out lie. And they'll make the statement that wireless radiation is perfectly harmless.
Mm.
The people that claim that they have electromagnetic hypersensitivity, well, it's totally psychosomatic. It's all in their heads, and it's not.
Quick break in the episode, you guys, because I got to tell you about the amazing sponsor, Aries Tech. Aries Tech creates cream of the crop, top of the line EMF protection devices that do not interfere with your signal, but all of their technology is actually backed by peer-reviewed, patent, and published research that has been going on for almost 20 years. They were originally funded a couple decades ago by the military to create a medical device that would help protect men and women who are working on radio signal towers without interfering with the signal, and have since become a consumer product as we have become more of a technological world. They're also used by professional athletes like Tiki Barber from the NFL Giants and Macy Barber from the UFC for performance optimization tools. You can go to their website, ariestech.com, and check out some really amazing studies where they've done some EEGs to show how these devices are affecting your baseline brain activity. It's really, really cool. I personally have one on me right now near me because I have my phone, my computer, my camera, everything going on all at once in an office building where everyone has their own Wi-Fi. So I don't mess around. Check them out, ariestech.com. Use code INTUNE, INTUNE, TUNE 30 for 30% off your entire order.
When you go and you look at what these sites like the National Cancer Institute and WHO, what they actually have to say is they kind of have some weasel words, what I call weasel words, claiming that there's not sufficient evidence to connect it to cancer or whatever, but it's really weasel words, and it doesn't say it's safe at all. But hearing all that and then finding out the epidemiology, the fact that if people live closer to a cell tower, their chances of dying of cancer increase, period. The closer you live to a cell tower, the more likely you are to die from cancer.
Okay, I have a question about that.
Yes.
So if you live directly under a cell tower, are you more protected than living like here? If you live here, would it go over and down?
So
you don't want to live under a cell tower. I'm just curious at what point, because does it go over before it goes down, or is it, do you know?
So the answer is that you have what's called a lobe. That you're going to project the energy where you want it. So you're not going to have an antenna that just sends the signal everywhere. You want to focus that energy, very much like a flashlight. In fact, light is electromagnetic energy. So you could think of a flashlight as being like an antenna. So it focuses the light in a particular location, and that's what cell antennas do. They do focus the energy where their clients are going to be, where the users are going to be. And so to answer your question, it can be less as you're right underneath the tower, and as you move away, the signal strength will increase, but still the radiation right under the tower is going to be significant.
Right,
and I have
because that's more like, like dirty electricity, right? Kind of coming off the tower itself.
Well, no, that dirty electricity is a different phenomenon.
Okay.
Not something we looked at, although I have myself, and I don't want to go into much detail about that right now.
Yeah, we won't.
Partly because we don't have the information about the relative risk of different frequencies, of different modulation types, and of low frequency magnetic fields like what you'd get from your house current.
Okay.
So we don't have enough information about it because industry has kept the agencies that would be responsible for dealing with that, they've kept them defunded. And the example is the Environmental Protection Agency. Around 1996, they had been allotted money by Congress to perform studies to answer the questions that I just, addressed. Things like dirty electricity, things like, modulating frequency and all that, but they were defunded so they could no longer perform the research to answer questions.
Okay,
So
really quick, before you continue, I feel like this is such a good point because so many people who say, well, there's not enough studies and not enough studies. You have to understand that studies can only happen if there's money to fund those studies. Telecommunication companies are not going to want to fund those studies with people who come in unbiasedly and like are actually looking for the truth, and getting the getting the finances you need to do a study like that is pretty significant.
But one thing I might want to be really clear about is we don't need any additional studies to know the harms of wireless radiation. It's there, it's significant, it's been proved decisively many, many times. And so that's kind of what the industry says. Well, more research is needed. And of course, we're keeping that research from happening.
Yeah.
The only reason we need more research is to answer some of the detailed questions.
Right.
We know it's harmful, but now what can we do to make it less harmful? We can answer those questions, but industry doesn't want the research to happen because it will reinforce the understanding that wireless radiation is harmful and we need to be addressing it. So it's pretty similar to what happened with tobacco. And if you look at some of the early ads for tobacco and the claims made by the tobacco industry about the safety, I don't know if you might have that slide that shows that the tobacco industry was advertising that smoking cigarettes does not cause cancer. And of course, when you think about it, does it cause cancer? Well, 5 out of 6 people who smoke don't die or don't get lung cancer. So have we proven, that it doesn't cause cancer? It's kind of like this sleight of hand that people will do that in industry to kind of keep us off the trail.
Okay, I like that. So we know that there's enough research to say it is absolutely harmful, but we still need more research to determine the best ways of going about all of it, basically. And like the best safety measures to put into play. So, but we already have the foundational research is there. We know now we just need to do more and expand beyond it.
Bingo, exactly.
Okay.
And we need to start protecting our kids yesterday.
Yeah.
Because kids are the most vulnerable. And that's the point I really want to reinforce.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to have a whole conversation on that next time. I really do.
We could, and I know people we can bring in who are experts on that.
Okay. So let's address the FCC. We went on in so many different directions, but I really feel like it was good to have a good foundation of like where you came from, how you came into this, what is going on in the world with EMF currently, what research is there. And now let's address the really big dispute, the really big question, which, anytime we try to have this conversation, the immediate dispute that I personally see in my own life is that, oh, well, it's FCC regulated, and why would they allow this to get this far if, you know what I mean? So what is the FCC and what does it do?
Okay, well, the first thing I want to address, which relates to what you're asking, is what are the FCC guidelines? If a cell tower company goes into any neighborhood, they're going to say, well, we're well within FCC standards. So what does that mean? And well, we're only 1% of FCC standards. Well, let me tell you where those standards came from, because that had a big impact on us in the commission. Turns out that the studies to determine the guidelines for exposure were set in the 1980s, and they were based upon short-term behavioral studies on 8 rats and 5 monkeys. 8 rats, 5 monkeys. Very small population to begin with, and in fact, yeah. And the fact that these studies lasted less than an hour is significant because we're all exposed 24/7. So in other words, the studies that were performed to determine the exposure guidelines couldn't take into account and didn't take into account long-term effects, the
Wow.
24/7, 365 that we're exposed to. And their assumption was that it was only the heating effect. Now, heating from microwaves, we all know that you put something in the microwave oven, and it gets radiated and it warms up. Those are heating effects, and absolutely they are dangerous. But what is also dangerous are the long-term low-level effects that are now well established. If you're around a cell tower, it's going to cause oxidative stress, which can lead to a host of illnesses. But their assumption was that it was only the heating effects that were to be that would be a problem. Now, here's the study. So they took these rats and monkeys, they put them in cages, and the animals had been trained to push a lever to get food. Yeah, it's not uncommon, and it's an easy thing for animals to learn, rats and monkeys. And so they food deprived the rats and monkeys before the test, before the experiment started. And then they started exposing those rats and monkeys to greater and greater amounts of radiation. And they stopped only when the rats and monkeys could no longer perform the simple task of pushing the lever for more food. So that's why it's called a behavioral study. So it didn't look at long-term effects at all. It just said when this animal gets so hot from exposure that it can't perform a simple task, well, what's going to be the threshold dose?
Yeah.
Some of the monkeys had burns on their faces from that very high level of radiation. But the people running the experiments defined that as the threshold dose for radiation, that very high level at which the animals could no longer function. And then they put in what they called a safety factor of 50 to apply to the general public. In other words, the general public could be exposed to that very high dose of radiation, even though, and then, by the fact that they divided it by 50, they didn't have any rationale for that using 50 as what they called the safety factor. It was totally arbitrary. Anybody familiar with epidemiology or setting safety limits know that you have targets about relative risk and things like that, and you don't use a single outcome on which to base that relative risk. But this was done, in a completely crude manner. And I have, the documentation for where that comes from, and it's in the slides that we'll be distributing. Don't need to go into too much detail except about why the industry fights so hard to maintain those ridiculous, and you can quote me, those limits are indeed ridiculous. Because think about what that would mean. I think it would change for people to understand what's going on. It would change their relationship with their cell phone. I still have mine. I use it. I love it. But there are a lot of things that you can do to make radiation or make what these phones do a lot safer. For example, I use airplane mode a lot. I turn the antennas off when I have it on my body. When I don't want to get too far afield.
Yeah.
But there's a lot that can be done.
Yeah.
And you can do a better job of siting cell towers. You don't need a strong signal to get a very good reception. To get 4 or 5 bars, you only need like a billionth of the FCC standards, a very tiny signal.
Wow.
For robust communication. People don't realize that. Now, the cheapest way to provide a big coverage area is to go to the center of a population area and put in your antenna, turn up the power to the maximum allowable, and you're going to get great coverage. And people, way away from the tower are going to get fine reception, but you're going to provide huge radiation to the people near the antenna.
Okay, so with the limits, were they taking it? I mean, obviously not with the way that study was, but like the current regulations, which the current regulations haven't changed at all since then, right? Since
No, they haven't.
1996.
That's right.
So what have they taken in account at all the kind of compounding effects of like, okay, the average person has a smartwatch on, a cell phone, has probably 2 kids in their car with a cell phone, has a smart fridge, has her Wi-Fi, like the Wi-Fi plugged in, has a smart TV. Like, are we taking in account all of these devices working together?
Michaela, you're asking the $1 million question. And the answer is that it's summative, it's cumulative. The more radiation sources you have around you, the more of an impact it's going to have on you personally. And how have things changed since 1996?
Yeah, a lot.
You know, particularly the electromagnetic landscape. You know,
Right.
we are so profoundly different, and there are
And
so
how many
many.
more studies have come out since 1996?
We know so much more now. We don't know. We need to know more, and there should be funding allotted to answer questions like the effect of satellite systems like Starlink.
Mm,
Is that even a
yeah.
good idea? It just
Yeah.
seems that we're in some countries they exercise what's called the precautionary principle. If you're introducing a technology that could potentially be harmful, it's incumbent upon the leaders of that country to make sure that the research is sufficient to show that there isn't harm.
Mm,
But that
yeah.
hasn't been done in this country. We don't believe in the precautionary
Yeah.
principle,
We're
although
trying,
some.
we're trying to find out.
That's exactly right. If
Yeah.
it has the potential to make somebody some money, and usually not the people who really need the money.
Right.
But if it has the potential, well, let's go forward with it. And really, that is what we're doing. We're unquestioningly, we can do it, so let's do it.
Okay. So I think you addressed this a little bit before, but like, what is the incentive for the FCC to not look at the, like, to not change the regulations? Like, why is
Well,
how is the FCC not completely separate entity than like what the telecommunication companies would want? How are those two things working?
so there is no incentive for them to do
Okay.
anything. So, and I think a lot of your listeners will know that a lot of government is not receptive to people now.
Right.
There's studies showing, what people want and based on surveys compared to what actually happens through the legislature, the federal government, they don't, align at all.
Yeah.
People's priorities are not enacted into legislation and vice versa. It's to benefit industry.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
so that's what happens because, and I have sympathy for legislators. If you're in as a senator, in fact, state or federal senator, uh, how do you keep in office? How do you get elected? Well, you're going to spend roughly 90% of your time going out and dialing for dollars, as it were. And so anything that takes away from that, like protecting people, you're
Yeah.
not going to do. And I'm not saying it's a flaw in the political system that needs
Right.
to be addressed because the senators, first of all, don't have time to learn about the issue. It takes a while to learn about it. And the fact that if they go against the telecom industry, which is arguably the highest profit industry on this planet,
Wow.
so you don't want to go, you want to mess with these guys because if
No.
they'll dump money into your opponent.
Mm.
So politically, it's at the upper level, at the federal level, there's really not
That's
much that's
very
going to
interesting
happen.
when you really think about it because like there's just like an imbalance of power. Like the the legislation is fighting for money, fighting for support, fighting for all these things, and you're going to have to do whatever these people who have the power and the money and want you to do in order to be able to continue on. So yeah, that is really interesting, and that division of power is very unbalanced. Like we, the foundational pieces that are supposed to be protecting this country are not self-sufficient. They're reliant on outside sources.
That's right. Without
Yeah.
those outside, although I'd love to see no money in politics, I know that
Yes.
that's a bit naive to say. But that is, we need to go in that direction. There was a Citizens United. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was legislation that opened up the gates for throwing money into the political system by outside. And
Okay.
so when that came into place, there was a huge increase in the amount of funding given from, well, political PACs and all that towards politicians. And of course, at that point, you have to, if you're a politician, you want to stay being a politician, you got to just play along.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. It's something that we need to change. And that was where a revolution of sorts has the potential to actually happen if we can make change in the funding of the political system.
Yeah. Not to get political, but you kind of have to in order to be able to address what's really going on.
Right, right. I don't
Okay,
think we want
so
to.
okay. So tell me a little bit about the Children's Health Defense and that lawsuit that happened? Because, we
Well, that
can
was
sit here and say all day there's research, but when you actually are like, okay, wait a second, no, the FCC actually lost a lawsuit about this. So can we talk a little bit about
right.
that?
It was the Environmental Health Trust and the Children's Health Defense
Okay.
in combination. Their suit, they had separate suits, but they were combined because they were so similar.
Yeah.
Basically saying, along the lines of the questions that you've been asking is, I can't say it on podcast, but what's going on, folks?
Right.
This is, crazy. You have these rules, and we provided them with 11,000 pages of documentation about the science behind wireless radiation exposure and harm. And so the conclusion, and this was back in August 13th, 2021, and the court, the DC District Court of Appeals, looked at the information and said, okay, FCC, you have some explaining to do. Why are you not addressing some very important issues like the environment and like health? And the FCC didn't give an adequate answer, so they lost in court. Now, that's the win.
The win. Mm-hmm.
But the fact that they did not put a deadline
Yeah.
made that win it took a lot of the win away, because if they had to comply by a certain date, they would have to have complied by that certain date. But when you don't have a deadline in there, nothing has happened. So here we are in 2024, and nothing really.
They can literally just say, "Oh, well, we're just waiting on the results of this 60-year study," and as soon as we
Along
know.
those lines, right? But so the win is there, it's documented, and it leaves an opening for follow-on legislation.
The important part of the win is for people to understand that this is real, and that it's been recognized. And I think that is the most valuable aspect of the win, is giving people the open door of acknowledgement and understanding that this is a real thing. And now, yes, okay, we understand this is real. It's been acknowledged this is real, but obviously the systems that are in place are not. The health is not the most important thing. And so now the health has to become the most important thing to us, taking the power back in our own homes, in our own environment, and doing what we can to ensure a safe environment, because it is not taboo. It is not tinfoil hat. It is not, what it has been, this topic has been, put out as. It's a very real thing. And if you just even did a little bit of digging, you'd find the information pretty quickly that is leading you towards this is
right, Michaela.
significant, especially in
and
children. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, especially in children.
Yeah.
So when I first started doing this, remember, I served on the commission. We got our result, made our finding, and I, decided, this is a problem. People need to know about it, because they're not going to hear it. Well, there are a number of reasons. They're not going to be told about the harms from the wireless industry, certainly not. And they're not going to hear about it from news outlets, because who are some of the major advertisers
Right.
on the news outlets? It's going to be telecom, and who owns a lot of the outlets. So they're not going to hear it from them. So I feel personally responsible for letting people know. And in the beginning, I got some accusations about my foil hat and all that. But over time, that has gone away. So now people are increasingly aware of it. I haven't been called a foil hatter in years now.
Yes.
And people just want to say, well, what's the truth, and what can we do to protect ourselves? And I'm ready to answer that question, because we did a deep dive into that as well.
Okay, so really quick, how many people were part of the commission, and what was the conclusion? And I know you already kind of touched on that, but let's wrap that piece of it up really quick. So how many people were part of this?
Okay. So we had a majority report. The way it works in New Hampshire is if you have a commission, and if anybody disagrees, they can write a minority report if they disagree with the majority. So we had 3 people affiliated with the telecom industry on the commission, and they had their own report. Didn't say much, except we don't like what they came up with. And then of the scientists, the 10, we came up with a majority report that said, yes, wireless radiation is harmful. And we had 15 recommendations. And they covered things like having safe spaces within public buildings, about setbacks for cell towers. And that setback that we came up with was 1,640 feet, which is 500 meters.
500 meters. Someone just asked me that yesterday.
And
Um,
I can go through excruciating detail about how we came up with that number.
okay.
But that is what we came up with. And frankly, if you were that far from a cell tower, I don't think you need to worry about it very much, unless you're electromagnetically hypersensitive. So we also had issues about protecting kids and, not having cell towers near schools, and that is a favored place for telecom to put cell towers, is on schools, for a variety of reasons that I don't necessarily have to go into right now, but I
Right.
can. But that's really disturbing to hear about. And as parents have gotten more savvy about the harms of radiation, they've become more politically active. I mean, you don't mess with somebody's kids.
Yeah.
So when parents would happen, it's a pattern that we've gone through a number of times. They look up and they see a tower going up on their kid's school, or they hear about it. They start looking on the internet, and oftentimes they come up with my name. And so they contact me, I give a presentation, and to give them the information very similar to what I'm giving you now. And they then become ballistic, as they should.
Yeah.
Kids are growing. This is an experiment. We don't know what happens when you expose a human body to this type of radiation 24/7.
Obviously the research is there that shows it's harmful, but what's the research on like second generation? Like, I think that we're really going to know it when our babies have babies, because our babies from utero are being exposed. And like those, I didn't know, I did not know, I am a woman and did not know this, that we develop all of our eggs throughout our lifetime that we're going to have in 20 weeks of being in
Right,
utero.
exactly.
And so if you're being exposed to these outside frequencies all day, every single day, how is that impacting
Well,
babies
actually,
that
we
your
have
babies will
answers.
have?
It affects the birth weight of, and we're talking about animals. And
Yeah.
so in the animal studies, the animals that were exposed during pregnancy had smaller babies than those who weren't exposed. I mean, we know these things, and we also know about sperm being affected. If you take sperm and you put it into two test tubes and you expose one to radiation and don't expose the other, you'll see significant and measurable differences in motility and viability. So
Yeah.
we know these things. And so as you hear about the decline in sperm count in this country and in most countries right now, it could be easily attributable to exposure. Where do people carry their cell phones?
Yeah.
Young men in their
Yeah.
pocket.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's finally kind of being acknowledged in the forefront on all these big podcasts like Joe Rogan and Andrew Huberman, and it's kind of that particular. They still don't address the full issue, but they will acknowledge that particular study
well,
about this.
I think it just takes a while for people. People are unwilling to make that big step about the harm, although that's something that the New Hampshire Commission has helped facilitate, is helping people to take that very important step.
The other thing I really wanted to talk about was the Environmental Health Trust, because you're now the president of the Environmental Health Trust. Talk a
Yes.
little bit about, because I had know so deeply about what that is, because I get so much of my information from it, but I have gone to talk about it and people are like, what is that? So will you tell a little bit about what the Environmental Health Trust does?
Well, I could start off by talking how I became familiar with it.
Okay.
So I, got asked to be on this commission. And so the first thing I, did the library search that I mentioned earlier, the literature search. And then I started going to the internet. Okay, what sources of information are there? And what was the best source that I found? Well, it was the Environmental Health Trust website. So that's where I got a lot of the information. And I contacted the Environmental Health Trust. I got Theodora Scarrato, and she was willing to work with me and provided information. And she's still there helping me, providing me
That's
with
awesome.
information. So what we see ourselves as being is very much educational. What are the harms? And you can't fight a harm unless you know what it is. And in the beginning, it's dealt with chemical toxins, but over time it evolved into dealing with this electromagnetic toxin. It's electro pollution, and it's growing. And so that has been kind of adopted as being a driving force is figuring out, helping with the research, helping to facilitate research into this arena, and then letting people know about it. What I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
There are probably people that are going to be listening to this podcast who have no idea about the harms.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them. And frankly, I can't blame industry because like I said, before I came into this, before I served on the commission, I thought it was harmless.
Right. And the answers were
relatively
there. You just weren't looking for them.
I wasn't, right.
Yeah.
So I hope that anybody hearing this podcast who didn't think there was a problem, do your own research. You'll see it. You don't have to dig very long and very deep to come up with the fact that it's harmful.
Do you think we could do an episode kind of breaking down how you do your own research? Because
oh my God, sure. Well,
yes, just
to.
a little bit of like, here's a study that came to be that EMS weren't harmful, and here's a study that came to be, you know what I mean? And kind of breaking down the metrics that were used and the analysis that had occurred and why, how to identify. Because I mean, I'm all for doing your own research, but like, don't be doing your own research via Instagram science. Like, you need to understand, right? Like, you need to have a basic understanding of how to read an abstract and how to read, what the actual like analysis that was used or the metrics that were used. So I'm still like, I rely heavily on my husband because my husband, he has an environmental science degree. So that's kind of his background. He's a lab analyst for the city of Waco. And so he does a lot of that for me and it breaks it down for me. But I would love to have your insights on just a basic understanding of like, how do you do your own, like how?
It's pretty boring.
Yeah, I know, but I think it's good.
Like I say, I did some of my work with a PhD in library sciences. How do you determine if something's junk science or not?
Yeah.
And
so to be continued on that because we're definitely going to get it. Yeah.
But and also
that needs to be its own episode. I'm ready.
We sure could. I'd bring Theodora Scarato into that as well.
That'd be great.
Really good at it. So to be continued.
Yes. Okay. So Environmental Health Trust, how do people get in contact with them? How do people get educated and connected there?
So I'm really glad you brought that up. It's time to put on my different hat. My advertising hat is simply go to Environmental Health Trust and look around. And we encourage people to join, to get the newsletter because you can get it sent to you. I think we all don't like places that market aggressively, and we don't do that. And we're thinking about coming up with a membership program because while we don't want to be too aggressive in reaching out, we also need input. We need money to do the things that we do. So I'd encourage you to become a member, and if you can, support us financially. We've had good support in the past. I'm happy.
That's awesome.
But that is the main thing, is just get on the site and then communicate with us. We're very reachable. And if you have a tower going in near you, and that's where we oftentimes get calls too, and that is people see trucks going out because the companies don't announce. Oftentimes they only announce to the degree they have to that they're going to put in a facility. So oftentimes people only find out too late. And the way the legislation works is that there's what's called a shock clock. And that is once they put in their petition or their application for a tower, for a permit, the clock starts and the town only has so long to respond. And if they don't respond within that time period, the permit is.
So is there any way to like know when someone's put in that permit? To know that like, is there anywhere to look where you'd be able to find that, oh, someone has a permit to put a cell tower up, like my neighbor, you know what I mean? Like, or no?
Well, I would think that there would be a place, a way of knowing, but as I've looked at some of these installations that have been done, only the abutters are sometimes notified. Or only people within a certain radius.
Okay.
And sometimes, there are people that are. Actually, I don't want to get into the politics of the process, but there is money that's involved because and there's actually I could spend a lot of time talking about the business incentive for the industry. What are they trying to accomplish? Why are they pushing these facilities so much? I know the answer. The commission knew the answer, and I could tell you about it, but it would take a while.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
I'm hopeful also that for you as a podcaster, we're presenting this information right now, and people are going to hear it, and they may say, that I don't need to hear any more about that, or they may have questions. And if they do, you and I can assemble those questions together, and I can address them directly.
Yes, please. Even in right in the podcast apps now, like in Spotify, if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can drop a question right in there that I can take to Dr. Kent and kind of plan another episode with him because I was like once I really had a conversation with you, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're the perfect person. I needed you in my life.
Well, it
These
was kind of like
questions.
the perfect situation. My background, electromagnetics. I'm a radio frequency engineer. I've done a lot of tower siting myself, not wireless cell towers, but I've worked for the Navy, the Air Force, the Department of Justice, the Federal Communication. So I've done work for a lot of people in a related issue. For different types of
Yeah.
communication. So, and then after serving on the commission, I have expertise in the other aspects of wireless radiation, the health effects. And so I have turned out to be just by happenstance, a good person to represent and answer questions about it.
Yeah. That's so cool. That's so cool. Did anybody else that was part of that commission have that same like reaction and wanting to partake more in what's happening in the world of EMF, or
Well,
did you
there's
take it on?
also another aspect of this. If you may have noticed in my introduction, I'm emeritus. So I'm no longer teaching. I'm still a faculty member, but I'm no longer teaching or have commitments at the university.
Mm,
And so people knew that. And then people on the commission knew that. And so when requests came in for somebody to represent the findings of the commission,
I
everybody
see.
pointed to me.
Yes, I see. This guy's perfect. Well, you also have that background in being able to communicate your findings, and I think,
Well,
you
I think
know,
that's important
yeah.
because people see this as being complex, and you mentioned electromagnetics, their eyes tend to glaze over. My students did at least. And then it
Yeah.
becomes the challenge of explaining it because the salient issues here are not complicated. You don't need
Yeah.
to know math to know that exposure is a problem. And we can even get into, and if people are interested, we could talk about how to measure exposure, how to protect yourself at home. There are lots of things you can do. And then what
Yeah.
the industry can do. And as I mentioned, I'm a radio frequency engineer, and I've done, design work relating to things like cell phones. And when we engineers were told to design these things and to design cell towers, we were never told to reduce radiation. We were simply told, well, make the data rates fast, and robust, and make them small, low power consumption, but never to reduce radiation. And there is a lot we can do. I've written was co-author on a paper where we talk about solutions, and I don't want to go into those
So
details
you're
right now.
saying that as part of that job, it was never addressed to lower EMF.
No, well, why would you if you thought it was completely harmless?
And
And
why would you if the regulations are so insignificant? They're
you just
yeah.
nailed it. Okay.
Yeah.
And so it just changes the whole paradigm if you admit that wireless radiation is harmful. It's a game changer. And that's why they don't want to go, the telecom industry don't want to go there. So you repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth. And that's what's going on right now. But there is a lot that can be done, but you have to admit there's a problem. There are low power routers, wireless, Wi-Fi within the home that lowers your radiation exposure by like 90%.
Mm.
Also, there's Wi-Fi calling where you can use your Wi-Fi at home. Just hook your phone up to Wi-Fi, turn on Wi-Fi calling, and we can talk about how to do that. It's not hard. And so whenever I'm at home, I'm using Wi-Fi calling and there's substantially less radiation from this phone when it's in Wi-Fi mode because it's not having, I'll give you some numbers.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Most people don't. So
Yeah.
there are lots of things
So
like
it's
that. you
better
can do.
to be so it'd be better to have your phone on airplane mode and then connected to Wi-Fi.
And your phone works perfect. Matter of fact, it works, for me, it works better than if I'm hooked up to the
Because
cell
then you're just getting the signal directly from Wi-Fi rather than why is that? Why?
Here are two things. One, to talk to a cell tower, cell towers are oftentimes far from your home. I don't even know where our local cell tower is that I'm communicating with on this thing.
Right.
But in fact, that fact alone says that this phone's using the higher power. The way it works, the way your phone works is if you're far away, it uses a higher power. And if you're closer to the cell tower, it uses a lower power. That higher power is about 3 watts. Now, I'm saying it like that because to me, that's significant. This is a 3 watt microwave transmitter, and that ain't small. So this is 3 watts, but when I'm using Wi-Fi, it's about 100 milliwatts or a 10th watt.
Okay.
So there's a factor of 30 there.
I got
So
you.
I'm using a much lower power transmitter when I'm in Wi-Fi mode.
You said so 3 watts if it's not connected to Wi-Fi, and then what was it if it is connected?
About 0.1 watt.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And so there are just lots of things, and I have to do that manually now when I come home. I turn it into airplane mode and I make sure that I'm connected to Wi-Fi, and it's perfect. It works perfectly.
Okay, I have an amateur question.
Go for it.
What is the difference between the gigahertz thing, the gigahertz and hertz and all of that, and watts?
Okay. And actually, I'm the right person to
Okay,
ask.
perfect.
So you're asking two separate issues. One is frequency. And so it's kind of like are you old enough to remember the tune-in, the dial radios?
Yes. I mean, I still have one in my office.
Okay,
Cool.
well, in that case, what you're doing is you're changing frequency by turning the dial.
Okay.
So you're looking at different frequencies. So that's frequency, and okay. And the second thing you're asking about is power.
Okay.
And so watts relates to power. How powerful is the radiation source? So what I just mentioned here is that when I'm into communicating with the cell tower, I'm using what can be a 3 watt transmitter.
Okay, so if the watts are higher, is it likely that the frequency would
Doesn't
be?
have anything. It's completely independent of frequency. Watts is power, and the frequency. The one thing we don't know about frequencies are which ones are the most harmful. And it would take a detailed study and an expensive study to answer that question.
Give us a little hope.
Oh, right. Here is the
Let's
hope.
end with a little hope, guys.
There is hope, absolutely. And that
Yes.
is once we acknowledge there's a problem from wireless radiation, there is so much we can do to lessen it. I mentioned earlier on that you don't need a strong signal to have robust communication. So let's site cell towers, particularly new cell towers, in locations where no people in highly populated areas get overly exposed. You can put the antennas other places. So you have very low radiation, and that's what I have. I'm really lucky. I have robust communication, but very low exposure that can be achieved. And I'm saying that as a radio frequency engineer.
That's
There
awesome.
are things that we can implement and design. We engineers created these phones. We can create safer ones. And so things like the lower power routers, I could go into the technical detail, but we can significantly lower the radiation from the wireless access points. And this is particularly important in your kids' schools. Take the routers, those wireless access points, out of the classroom, put them in the halls where kids are for a shorter period of time. Right now, we have kids spending the day under a router, getting huge exposures. And I've gone in and I've made those measurements before. So there's
Wow.
so much we can do. It's simply acknowledging that there's a problem, and then we can address that problem. And the other one I got to mention is using wired connections. I'm using a wired connection now. I could say a lot more about it, but it's a wired connection that I put in the 1990s when the internet first came out, using Ethernet. It's a name that some of you may remember.
I've been Googling it lately, trying to figure out, because we're about to move, and I'm like, okay, how do I go about this? Who do I call?
It's okay. I put it in myself.
Okay.
But but if you use wired connection, then you're going to not have any exposure at all from it, or almost no exposure at all. So wired connections, the use of fiber optics, some places do that very effectively, like Chattanooga, Tennessee, of all places. They are using, they're called the gig city, and they went in with fiber optics is instead of wireless, and they've gotten tremendous results from that in terms of security, in terms of data rates, in terms of lots of things, and not being jammable, not being hackable. So there are lots of things, and we could even spend a whole show talking about.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, because I want you to break down. Maybe the next time too, we can break down kind of like how wireless works. You know, if you were to live in like a suburban area, what's actually happening, what the security issues, and then like,
oh my gosh, I'm
people
ready
can
to
do. Yeah, we'll get.
I'm ready.
Okay, we're good.
Bring it on.
All right, guys, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you being here, Dr. Kent. And please, everyone, go check out the Environmental Health Trust. We actually get a lot of our information from them. And I didn't even know when I got on my first call with Dr. Kent that he was the president of the Environmental Health Trust. I had contacted him for other reasons because I saw that he was a big part of this conversation. And so it was really cool to be able to be like, oh, okay, make that connection. And so please go support what they do. We really heavily rely on all of the information, and we really try to showcase the different things that they're doing, and as far as like public initiatives and stuff like that. So please help and support. And then also you can get a breakdown of this episode at wave.ariestech.com and post any of your questions in the comments of the podcast, because thankfully I have recruited this man for multiple episodes. We will come and answer more questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity, Michaela.